Hello, my name is Zach Gibbs, and I am a content developer within education services inside Juniper Networks. And today we will be discussing the Integrated User Firewall JWeb Learning Byte. So here is our example, and in this example we have a couple different users. We have user 1 and user 2, and we have an Active Directory server on the left and vSRX 1 in the middle. And then we have a database server that is hanging off of vSRX1, and then the internet, which is also hanging off of vSRX1. And there's a server out there on the internet that we'll be using to do some tests. And so with this, the criteria for the case study is we need to configure Integrated User Firewall using JWeb with some criteria. That criteria is listed on the slide. First, user 1 can access the database server. User 2 cannot access the database server. And then both users need to access the internet. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and jump to JWeb for vSRX1. All right, so here is the JWeb for vSRX1, and we are going to first go to configure mode, and then we're going to go to user firewall, and then Active Directory. And we need to create an Active Directory configuration on vSRX1 to communicate with the Active Directory server. So let's begin by clicking the Create Active Directory button. Okay, so first we have some general information, and with this general information, we want to configure a few different things. These values do have their defaults, so if you don't configure them, then there'll be some defaults, so don't worry about that. But here we're going to configure the authentication entry timeout. We're going to configure that to 30 minutes. And then the WMI timeout, we're going to configure to 10 seconds. And we really don't need to configure anything else. Now, the one thing I do want to point out here is there's a little bit of a bug here with 19.1R1. And we're going to want to enable the on-demand probe. But the funny thing how this works with the little bug here is if we click enable, it actually disables on-demand probes. So keep that in mind. We're going to leave that disabled and it will actually enable it. Now, that's a bug. That's something that is being taken care of for the next version. So, but just keep that in mind if you are using 19.1R1 that you need to leave that disabled if you actually want it enabled. So just a little tip there to be aware of. Let's click next and we'll work on the domain settings. We need to create a new setup or new configuration for a domain. Okay, so the first thing we need to specify is the domain name. Here it's going to be juniper.net, and then we need to specify the administrator credentials or a user credentials who has access to search the LDAP tree. Here it's going to be administrator, and then I'm going to specify the password. And then we need to add some domain controller information. This domain is just going to be named DC1, and then we need to specify the IP address. Now this is going to be how the SRX communicates or accesses the domain controller. So this needs to be reachable from the SRX is what I'm getting at. That's going to be 172.16.1.253. And then we don't need to specify anything in the user group mappings LDAP section if the IP address for the LDAP server is the same as the domain controller. If it's not, then we do need to specify something there. But in this instance, the LDAP server is on the same server as the domain controller. And that's going to be DC equals Juniper, comma, DC equals net. And we don't need to specify a username and password here if the LDAP server is also the domain server. But we do have to specify the base distinguished name. And then we want to set the authentication algorithm to simple since we're not using encryption in this setup. And we don't need to specify anything else. We're okay here if we just click OK. And then let's click Finish. All right, so that configuration has validated successfully, no problems there. So we can review the configuration info. And just remember, with 19.1R1 with JWeb, it shows the on-demand probe as disabled. That means it's actually enabled. If you needed to disable that, you need to select the enable option. That's definitely not how it's supposed to be. That's a mistake, so keep that in mind. That's something that will be fixed in the future. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and create the security policy rules. So let's select security policy, then rules, and then we'll create a new policy rule. We'll call this rule UFW for user firewall -LB for learning byte and allow. If I could type. All right, there we go. Source, say from user zone, and this is going to go to any address. That's fine. And then we need to select the actual user address. So what are we going to allow? We said that user 1 needs access to the DMZ server, right? So let's add a new identity. We'll call this juniper.net/user-1. So we specify the domain of juniper.net / then the username, user-1. Click OK. Then OK again. Then we'll click Next. And by default, it's going to the DMZ zone. Perfect. We'll just click Next. And then we want to permit this. Click Next and Finish. There's the summary. Just click OK. Let's go ahead and add a new role. We'll call this role UFW-LB-block. Click Next. And then from the user zone, select the select link for identity and create a new identity. We'll call this one juniper.net/users. So that'll catch all other users, which includes user 2. Click OK. Click Next. Go into the DMZ zone again. Great. Then we'll just set this to reject. Finish this rule off. And then let's create a third rule that will allow internet access for both users. UFW LB INET access. Source, where's it? Users. We're going to select, and we're going to add in that juniper.net/users. Click OK. Click Next. This is going to the untrusted zone. Next. We're going to permit this traffic. Click Next, Finish, and click OK. And so I do want to point out something real quick. We can see here that the user firewall LB allow, so the first role, which permits, is allowing, then the second role, which is denying. Now that might seem a little counterintuitive because usually we have the deny rule first, but in this instance, it's fine because the UFW LB allow rule is more specific. It's just matching on one user, whereas the UFW LB block rule is matching on a broader match term of the user's group. So that's okay. Then our last rule is going to allow internet access with anybody from the users group coming from the user zone to the untrusted zone. That first set of rules was users to DMZ. So let's go ahead and commit that configuration. All right, the commit is complete. So let's go ahead and jump to the users. Let's see what happens. All right, so here is user 1. So open up Chrome. Let's try to get to that DMZ server. No problem. That's perfect. We need to get to the DMZ server. I'm using an old Firefly perimeter image for this, so that's why you're seeing this old, outdated looking UI. It's really low resources, and so that's why I'm using that. And so let's go ahead and try to go to the internet server. No problem getting to the internet server. Perfect. So user 1 can get around. Let's go ahead and log into user 2. All right, so here is user 2. Try to get to the DMZ server first and immediately rejected. We get that connection reset. No problems. That's exactly what we should be seeing. User 2 should not be able to access the DMZ server. Then let's go to the internet server. Great. We can get to the internet server with user 2. That's exactly what we wanted to see. So one last thing to look at is, unfortunately, in JWeb, there's no real good validation commands or workspace for user firewall. So we need to jump to the CLI. So there's a few things in the CLI I do want to show you. Okay, here is the CLI for vSRX 1. So I want to show services user identification, Active Directory access, domain controller, status. We want to see if the SRX device is connecting to the domain controller. And we can see here, domain controller DC1 has a connected status. And so that's perfect. That's what we want to see. And then we want to do the show services user identification, Active Directory, statistics, IP user mapping. And this will show you that the SRX device, the vSRX1 here, is connecting to whatever domains. Here we are connecting to the juniper.net domain and show you the IP info statistics on scans that's happened. Now, the one thing I do want to point out here is the failed log query times and the number of records fetched. Those are very important values. If you see that failed log query times just incrementing, that's very likely either an authentication issue or a connectivity issue. And then if that's incrementing, you probably won't have anything in the number of records fetched filled. That will probably be empty because if it can't actually get to the AD server, then it can't actually pull the records from the AD server. All right, so the next one I want to show is the show services user identification Active Directory access Active Directory authentication-table. Okay, I spelled authentication wrong. Let's try that again. Authentication table. Now that Active Directory authentication table is a hidden command, so you got to type that all the way out. And we can find some information here. We can see here that user 1 and 2 are present in the juniper.net domain. And we can see the administrator user, which is vSRX 1, is also present. That's the IP addresses associated with each. And we do have some entries under the null domain, which means they're not allowed access through. So keep that in mind. That will show up there. So we have an unauthorized user. It's going to show up in the null domain. So that does bring us to the end of this Learning Byte. In this Learning Byte, we discussed how to configure Integrated User Firewall using JWeb, and then we demonstrated how to verify Integrated User Firewall as well. And so, as always, thanks for watching.
Visit the Juniper Education Services website to learn more about courses. View our full range of classroom, online, and e-learning courses. Learning paths, industry segment and technology-specific training paths. Juniper Network's certification program, the ultimate demonstration of your competence. And the training community, from forums to social media. Join the discussion.